Lake Ontario is the smallest Great Lake by surface area and the second smallest by volume. Lake Ontario is also at the lowest elevation above sea level than the other four lakes. The St. Lawrence River, which connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, starts in Lake Ontario. But just like the other four lakes, Lake Ontario has a deadly reputation when it comes to shipwrecks. Thousands of wrecks lay at the bottom of the lake, many of them are poorly documented and remain undiscovered. Here are 5 ominous shipwrecks on Lake Ontario. On October 26, 1898, the 25-year-old schooner St. Peter departed Oswego, New York with a full load of coal bound for Toledo, Ohio. However, the very next day, the schooner would find herself at the bottom of Lake Ontario. Constructed in 1873 in Toledo, Ohio, the St. Peter was a wooden-hulled, 3-masted schooner designed to transport general cargo throughout the Great Lakes. She came in at 290 gross tons and measured 136 feet or 41 meters in length. She navigated the Great Lakes for 25 years with no major incidents. But that all changed on the morning of October 26, 1898. The St. Peter departed Oswego, New York with a full load of coal bound for Toledo, Ohio, via the Welland Canal. However, just a few hours after she left port, Lake Ontario was being overtaken by a massive storm, with 70-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. Since they were unable to reach the Welland Canal, Captain John Griffin of the St. Peter decided to turn around so they would run with the wind. The ship fought her way through the storm for 12 hours, but in the early morning hours of October 27th, the St. Peter finally succumbed to the storm. She rolled over and sank just a few miles offshore. All but Captain Griffin was able to escape the sinking ship. When the storm cleared, he was rescued by a boat from the life-saving station in Charlotte, New York. He was the only survivor from the St. Peter. In the end, 8 people were lost in the disaster. The St. Peter sank in only 117 feet of water, so when she went down, her masts were still above the water. They were later removed so they wouldn't be a danger to passing ships. In 1971, most of the remains of the ship were recovered from the wreckage. Today, the wreck of the St. Peter lies only 5 miles northeast of Sodus, New York, in around 120 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Ontario. The wreck is a popular dive site, and it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in March of 2004. The wreck is also part of the Lake Ontario National Marine Sanctuary and is one of the most accessible wrecks to divers on Lake Ontario. Exactly 14 years after the loss of the St. Peter, another vessel was lost in the St. Lawrence River. Labeled hull number 844, the Keystorm was constructed in 1910 by the Swan Hunter and Wingham Richardson shipyard in Wallsend, England for the Keystone Transportation Company based in Montreal. The ship was launched on March 30th, 1910 and entered service a few weeks later. She came in at 1,721 gross tons and measured 250 feet or 76 meters in length. She was designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River and the Welland Ship Canal, allowing her to transport cargo between the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and her brief career was productive and mostly uneventful. On the afternoon of October 25, 1912, the Keystorm departed Charlotte, New York with a load of 2,273 tons of coal bound for Montreal. At around midnight, the Keystorm passed the Tibbetts Point Lighthouse and entered the St. Lawrence River. Not long afterward, the ship's captain passed command over to his first mate and left the bridge, but when he retired to his cabin at 3 a.m., a dense fog bank set in over the St. Lawrence. Despite this, her crew did not reduce the ship's speed. The captain was extremely apprehensive about his first mate's skills, and the weather conditions at the time only made him doubt his skills even more. Regardless, the Keystorm soon passed the Sunken Rock Lighthouse in Alexandria Bay as she made her way downriver. The first mate soon saw the light from Sisters Island Lighthouse through the fog, but he didn't see the buoy which marked the nearby shoals. Then, in the early morning hours of October 26th, the first mate called down to the captain, but it was too late. In the fog, the Keystorm struck the Skull Island shoals. Not long after the collision, the Keystorm slid off the rocks and into deeper water. In just a few minutes, the Keystorm rolled over onto her starboard side and disappeared beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence River. But fortunately, all of her crew survived the sinking. Following the sinking, the captain and first mate were found guilty of negligence for not taking appropriate action when they encountered the fog bank. Although there were no casualties, the Keystorm was declared a total loss. In 1917, the wreck of the Keystorm was sold to James Richardson and Son of Kingston, Ontario, and in 1919, her cargo of coal was salvaged. Today, the wreck of the Keystorm lies on her starboard side in roughly 115 feet of water at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. In early August 1917, another 3-masted schooner went down on Lake Ontario in almost the exact same circumstances as the St. Peter. Constructed in 1882 in Muskegon, Michigan, the George A. Marsh was a wooden-hulled, three-masted schooner designed to transport bulk cargo throughout the Great Lakes. She came in at 175 gross tons and measured 118 feet or 36 meters in length. She was constructed at a time when schooners were still fairly common on the Great Lakes, and by the early years of the 20th century, she would frequently be towed by a larger vessel. The Marsh underwent several refits during her career, and in April 1914, she was sold to J.B. Flint of Belleville, Ontario. Aside from that, her 35 years on the lakes were largely uneventful. On August 7, 1917, the George A. Marsh, under the command of Captain John W. Smith, departed Oswego, New York with a load of coal bound for Kingston, Ontario. On board were many of Captain Smith's relatives, including his wife and 5 of his children. However, only 3 hours after the schooner left port, a summer storm began to churn up the lake. By that evening, the Marsh battled 35-mile-per-hour winds and massive waves that repeatedly broke over her deck. On top of that, she had also sprung a leak. Her pumps were unable to keep up with the leak, and the ship was filling with water faster than it could be pumped out. The ship sat so low in the water that Captain Smith realized that the only way to keep his ship afloat was to beach her on the shoals off Pigeon Island. All through that night, the Marsh continued fighting her way through the storm, but in the early morning hours of August 8th, she suddenly rolled over and disappeared beneath the surface, throwing all 14 people on board into the raging seas. One of her lifeboats had drifted free from the ship, and 2 crew members were able to climb on board, but the other 12 never resurfaced. In the distance, the lightkeeper at the 9 Mile Point lighthouse spotted the George A. Marsh go under, but there was nothing he could do to offer assistance. That night, the 2 men in the lifeboat fought their way through the monstrous waves, and they soon made it to Amherst Island. The next morning, they were rescued by a local fisherman. They were the only survivors from the George A. Marsh. Many theories emerged on what caused the ship to have such a high loss of life. Some claim that the crew members bringing their family and children on board was a bad idea. Others also claim that the George A. Marsh was well past her prime, and was not seaworthy enough to handle the storm she sank in. The ship sank in only 80 feet of water, so her masts were still above the water when she sank. A few months after she went down, her masts were removed so they wouldn't be a danger to passing ships. But in the end, the George A. Marsh was just another victim of the Great Lakes. In the early morning hours of May 31st, 1926, the Canadian freighter Nisbet Grammer was making a routine voyage from Buffalo, New York to Montreal when she was enveloped in a heavy fog bank on Lake Ontario. Unbeknownst to the crew, however, in just a few hours, they would be on a direct collision course with another freighter and would end up at the bottom of Lake Ontario. Labeled hull number 901, the Nisbet Grammer was constructed in 1923 by the Camel Laird & Company shipyard in Birkenhead, England for the Eastern Steamship Company based in St. Catharines, Ontario. Her keel was laid down on February 2, 1923, and her hull was launched a few months later on April 14th. She came in at 1,725 gross tons and measured 253 feet or 77 meters in length. She was built as a canal freighter, designed to traverse the lock of the St. Lawrence River and Welland Ship Canal, and for the next 3 years, she reliably transported various cargo throughout the Great Lakes. In the early morning hours of May 31st, 1926, the Grammer departed Buffalo, New York with a load of grain bound for Montreal. She soon made her way through the Welland Ship Canal and reached Lake Ontario, but at around 4:30 a.m., the Grammer was overtaken by a dense wall of fog. At the same time, another vessel, the 5-year-old freighter Del Warwick, was also making her way across Lake Ontario not far from the Grammer when the fog set in. The crew of the Grammer reduced their ship's speed as the fog continued to thicken. The fog was so thick that neither vessel could see each other. They could only hear the faint sounds from the Del Warwick's fog whistle. Both ships navigated through the fog for the next hour, before suddenly the crew of the Grammer heard the Del Warwick's fog whistle literally in their path, and soon the Del Warwick emerged from the fog. The captain of the Grammer ordered the ship to turn hard to starboard to avoid being struck by the Del Warwick, but at that point it was too late. At around 5:30 a.m., the Del Warwick struck the Grammer on her port side near the stern, piercing her boiler rooms and cutting the ship's power. Her crew knew that they didn't have long until their ship would sink. They deployed a few of their lifeboats, and the crew of the Del Warwick sent some of their lifeboats as well. Only 15 minutes after the collision, the Grammer sank stern first and disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Ontario. Fortunately, all of her crew made it off the ship and onto the Del Warwick. The wreck of the Nisbet Grammer was discovered in August of 2014 by a group of researchers. She lies 30 miles from the shore of Somerset, New York, in roughly 500 feet of water. As of the making of this video, she remains the largest shipwreck on Lake Ontario. At around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of September 17, 1949, Dawn Church, a fire insurance specialist, was on board the passenger steamer Noronic while she was docked in Toronto. He soon discovered that the ship's hallways were filled with smoke, and he also found a small fire in a locked closet. He called one of the Noronic crew members who went to open the closet, but when he did, the flames exploded, and the fire began to quickly spread throughout the ship, leading to one of the deadliest maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. Labeled Hull Number 6, the Noronic was constructed in 1913 by the Western Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company in Port Arthur, Ontario for the Canada Steamship Lines, or CSL for short. She was one of 8 passenger cargo vessels built for CSL in the late 19th and early 20th century. The vessel was launched on June 2, 1913, and she entered service a few weeks later. She came at 6,905 gross tons and measured 362 feet or 110 meters in length. She was designed to carry passengers and cargo throughout the Great Lakes and could accommodate 600 passengers and 200 crew. For the next 36 years, the Noronic reliably transported passengers and cargo all across the lakes, and even earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes during her career. On September 14, 1949, the Noronic departed Detroit for a 7-day pleasure cruise of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, where she would sail through Lake Ontario and stop in Toronto along the way, then travel up the St. Lawrence River to Prescott, Ontario, before then sailing back through Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and finishing her voyage in Sarnia, Ontario. On the evening of September 16th, the Noronic arrived in Toronto Harbor and docked at Pier 9. While she was docked, many passengers had left the ship to explore the city, while others stayed on board. The passengers who left the ship had returned to the vessel at just after 10 p.m. At 2:30 a.m., Don Church was returning to his cabin on the Noronic when he found the hallways filled with haze, which soon turned into a cloud of smoke. He soon found a fire in a locked linen closet, but when a crew member came to open the closet, the fire quickly burst out and engulfed the room. The passengers and crew tried to extinguish the fire, but they failed to put it out. Don Church soon went to alert his family. 30 minutes later, half of the Noronic's decks were engulfed in flames. The first mate sounded the fire alarm, but it failed to get most of the passengers' attention. On top of that, her whistle was malfunctioning at the time, and the captain wasn't on board at the time. Many of the passengers were still asleep when the fire started, giving them almost no hope of escape. For those who managed to navigate through the smoke-filled hallways and make it on deck, they faced another problem. The ship was repeatedly moving back and forth away from the pier, so if they tried to jump overboard, they would get crushed between the ship's hull and the concrete pier. A ladder was soon raised to the ship to assist the people still on board, which did help the passengers to a certain extent. Later, the fire department and police had arrived on the scene to rescue the passengers and put out the fire, but the fire continued to rage on. When the fire eventually went out, the Noronic was now a gutted shell, resting at the bottom of Toronto Harbor. She remained there for a few months before she was salvaged from the bottom of the harbor and was towed to Hamilton, Ontario to be scrapped. It's estimated that at least 119 people lost their lives in the disaster. The cause of the fire remains a mystery. After the Noronic disaster, safety regulations on Great Lakes steamers had been heavily changed, but to this day, the fire aboard the Noronic remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. In addition to the 5 shipwrecks we just mentioned, it's said that Lake Ontario has its own Bermuda Triangle, similar to Lake Michigan. The Marysburgh Vortex stretches between Oswego, New York, Kingston, and Prince Edward, Ontario, and just like the Lake Michigan Triangle, it has had an unusual amount of strange disasters and sightings. In fact, the George A. Marsh, which we covered earlier, is said to be a victim of the Marysburgh Vortex. In 1889, the schooner Bavaria was being towed in the area when the tow line snapped and she drifted away. The ship was found a few days later near Main Duck Island, completely abandoned. No trace of her crew was ever found. Then, in 1900, another schooner, the Picton, disappeared on Lake Ontario in plain sight of 2 other vessels. The only trace of the ship ever found was a message in a bottle. It's believed that the high number of shipwrecks can be explained by the fact that Lake Ontario narrows as it nears the St. Lawrence River and becomes much shallower, creating navigational hazards for passing ships. Known as the Duck-Galoo Ridge, it lies between Main Duck and Galoo Island. But even with the high number of disasters and strange sightings, Lake Ontario isn't much different than the other 4 lakes in terms of shipwrecks, although many of Lake Ontario's shipwrecks are poorly documented and remain undiscovered. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss any new uploads from this channel. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.